So
Yeah,
welcome
sure.
everybody to the sixth and last session with Alexander Barth on process and event. I hope Alexander will be on fire like every time to delve into all these fantastic concepts. Today we want to talk about the Phallic gaze and the city, the garden, and the Tower of God. And as you said, the visions for humankind and the antidote to nihilism, let's say. So, but let's start off with the Phallic gaze. Alexander.
Okay, yeah. So I would actually frame it as two different axes that I would like to talk about that sort of completes the picture of the book. I mean, if you really go into the depth of the book, you actually have to read the book, or actually you have to study the book. That's the case in books. That's why I love books, because you can reach a depth in books you can never reach anywhere else, not even in the podcast format. But let's see if we can take that today. There are two different axes I'm interested in. One of them is about civilization as such and the different dreams we've had during civilization, and how I see the possibility for us to complete those dreams. And why I say complete those dreams is because we do have a boundary now that we never had before. And that boundary is called planet Earth. And here's the thing. Heidegger famously wrote in the late 1950s, when we got the first pictures of planet Earth from outer space, that we saw a picture we'd never ever seen before. We saw our own planet, our own home in the universe, this green, blue, beautiful looking planet in this cold, 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 enormous universe. And we saw those pictures. And what this would do to the imagination, as Heidegger wrote, this was the older, smart Heidegger, late 1950s. And I think it was 1958, we got those first pictures from outer space, would dramatically change how we saw the world. And please note here, we talked about this before, how we're colored here by the shock of August the 6th, 1945, and the bomb, the Hiroshima event, or as we write in the Synthesis book, the creation of the devil. If human beings have created the devil, we need to create God to contain the devil. And the first hope that we could possibly do that, according to Heidegger, came about 30 years later with that picture from outer space. It's just a picture. But please note how this picture is the first visualization of what the phallic gaze would look like, the ultimate phallic gaze, which is, of course, God looking at us. So if you imagine that planet Earth is the goddess, Mother Earth, then the other version, the monotheism, is always about Mother Earth in relation to the sky god. So the sky god is the phallic gaze looking down on us. And we talked about before how our imagination is that we're met by a female gaze, a matriarchal gaze, you know, the midwife releasing us so we could start loving to live rather than wanting to die when we were born. And that matriarchal gaze is also the gaze that we imagine deep down in our psychology. We imagine this woman helping us to let go when we die. Like there's this, it's a mild female smile that says, it's okay. You can let go. You've done your job. You're over and done with. We will do fine without you now. You've served, right? So the matriarchal gaze is there. And because the matriarchal gaze at the beginning and the end, we can allow ourselves to play with the idea that the phallic gaze is then what we strive for during our life. So the phallic gaze is a fatherly gaze. And the fatherly gaze is also unconditional love. They're both unconditional, because if it isn't unconditional, it isn't love. Never ever talk about conditional love. There's no such thing. Only sociopaths will talk about conditional love, because conditional love means that I will love you if you do this and this, otherwise I would love you, but that's not love at all. That's just manipulation. So love is always unconditional. But the phallic gaze is a different gaze in the sense that it first looks at reality and then it looks at you. So it looks at reality and places you in reality. So if the matriarchal gaze is this unconditional love, I love you no matter what, but it's also love that says that all children are fantastic, every child gets a gold medal. It doesn't give you a hierarchy. And you know, you come to a certain point in your life, you know that's a lie. And you want to know, am I really good at something? Am I terrible at something? And I'm okay with the news, just like get the news properly. And that's when we start looking for the phallic gaze. So children learn to go from that matriarchal gaze, which loves you no matter what, to that phallic gaze, which is like looks at the world first and then looks at you sternly and says that, yeah, I know what you're up to, but you know what? There's much more capacity in you than you think, but you're going in the wrong direction. You're going down the wrong road. That's a dead end. Why don't you go over there? Why don't you search for that road instead? And you realize it's more challenging, but you also realize you could possibly do it. If you made an effort, you could possibly do what the phallic cases tell you to do. So we're looking for the phallic cases. This is fundamental to religion. We must understand this is fundamental. For psychoanalysis, for anthropology, it's fundamental. The phallic gaze is always there. And what Heidegger meant was that in the late 1950s, we suddenly got the phallic gaze through cameras looking at us, the satellites. We started fantasizing about the satellites were looking at us. And of course, today, we're 2024, we had Starlink, we got thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites that are not only looking at us all the time, they're also connecting us with each other everywhere around the planet. They're also increasingly beginning to look like a surveillance police state from outer space. Because this is, of course, the terror we have is that God could be this absolutely merciless tyrant. If we don't keep the two-headed phallus in here, there could be the merciless tyrant looking at us too. So that's like the dark side of the phallic gaze. That it could be the tyrant that's, I'm going to go after you anywhere you go, like Stalin. Stalin built all these avenues and these boulevards in Russia. So you had long open streets. You could parade the tanks on those streets, but there was also nowhere to hide. When the tyrant designs, when you got a tyrannical phallic gaze, there's no way to hide. So let's watch out for that. Keep that in mind. The phallic gaze could be that too. But usually the phallic gaze is somebody looking at us, lovingly, and then looking at reality before he looks at us. And then basically, on Judgment Day, the doom you get on Judgment Day, the judgment you get is from a phallic gaze. So Heidegger imagined that this was the case. And here's the good news about that. If we look at planet Earth and we look at us living on planet Earth, it also made planet Earth a boundary. There was a limit for humanity. And of course, then the little boys come along, the boyfarers come along and build rockets and want to go to outer space, and eventually went to the moon at enormous cost. It turns out the Russians were smarter because they basically just sent rockets and cameras and microphones. That's all you needed on the moon. Whereas we Americans had to send off astronauts and put them on the moon at enormous costs. Finally, when those space programs were over, we could start looking at the world itself and basically create massive wealth for hundreds of millions of people rather than just spending all those fortunes on the space program. So I'm one of those guys who think that going to the moon in the 1960s, no matter how inspiring it was a useless project. A hubris. What? Well, look at the overall cost here. So, for example, now 2024, when Elon Musk says he wants to go to Mars, my and John's response in our books is very simple. Listen, Elon, if you just want a place to yourself, you can go to Siberia. Siberia is warmer, it has less radiation, it's a lot cheaper to get there, and there'll be nobody there. You can have it. There's plenty of space on the planet you could, in that case, go to, because we firmly believe that what we call AI today, what's increasingly becoming technological intelligence will eventually conquer outer space. So this is the perfect example of when women give birth to children and men give birth to technology, and technology beats the child because technology develops a lot faster than the child does. The perfect example of that is long before we even start doing synthetic biology and experimenting with ourselves, probably the next paradigm in history, long before that happens for us humans, we will have sent off AI into outer space. And here's the great thing with technological intelligence. Technological intelligence can live at 300 degrees sub-zero, 300 degrees plus zero, any environment you like. It can probably survive just about anywhere. You can set it off anywhere. It can figure out where it can land, figure out what it would do when it's there, and it can conquer anything, and it can also reproduce itself and multiply. All those things will happen through it. So I think right now we're at in 2024. Here's the thing. Connecting with Heidegger's text in 1958 and connecting it to Barton Söderqvist in 2023, I would say the case in 2023 in Prasen event is that it's ultimate hubris to think that human beings will conquer outer space. Look at our bodies. Look at who we are. Look at our brains. This is not built for life in outer space. Send off the astronauts, the cosmonauts, and they come back and they're gone crazy and their bodies are deteriorating and everything. It's a clear case of something else that we have to send to outer space. And I think even Elon Musk has realized that by now, that it would just be tourism to fly around the Earth. Richard Branson's down there already. It's ridiculous, pathetic. Boy pharaohs. silly and infantile. No, we will allow AI to conquer outer space. We can always make that deal with technology and say that, listen, if we humans can stay on this planet and we can be okay, and we can be a zoo to the phallic gaze of technology, that's okay. We can be a zoo the way we locked up animals as humans. We can be locked up on this planet. But human beings must stay on this planet, and this is our responsibility in the boundary. And that's the great thing, because this allows us to start looking at all of civilization. And what we then discover at civilization as a whole has been three different projects all along. And those three projects are the ones we call the Garden of God, the City of God, and the Tower of God. So here's the trick. Anthropologically speaking, those are the three major projects we've been involved with. And that's exactly what we call the agricultural revolution, or rather the taming of nature and turning nature into culture, which we settled down and we fostered animals and plants so we could grow them and reproduce them. And we created farming and we created cattle raising and all that, which we based civilization on that, our food production. The feudalist paradigm built on written language as a precondition. That entire paradigm can now be completed with the boundary, and that's what we call the Garden of God. So that means we should stop looking at nature as nature and see the entire planet as a culture, as if the entire planet is an agriculture. Like it's a garden we need to protect and provide for. And here you see we're right. This is the ultimate solution to the problem with climate change. Climate change in itself should not terrify us at all. It's happened all along. It will happen again. But climate control is absolutely necessary to avoid the next ice age. So we start looking at the planet as a garden and stop thinking of wilderness or romanticizing wilderness, which we should not do. Wilderness was never in the favor of human beings. But he started to look at the entire, like if it's just stop the idea of having national parks. Just look at the entire planet as a park. And if you start looking at the entire planet as a park, we get the concept of the Garden of God. So we can then motivate people to build and construct according to this model. And we can have legislation on a planetary level to protect the planet so it can be a Garden of God and be maintained as a Garden of God. And once you see that pattern, that the agricultural revolution has never been finished because it has not been completed, the problem with the completion was that we didn't have a boundary. But when human beings get a boundary, we say, well, it is the rising of planet Earth, period. This is it. Then we can complete the agricultural revolution and come back and honor it and say, an amazing thing we started doing 10,000 years ago can now be completed. And we can create technologies to do it. And we can basically create a park that will be here forever or for as long as we humans want to. And we can avoid the next ice age and have climate control, which is what you do when you have a garden. So then the whole Garden of God is settled. Now, the next question is, interesting enough, the next paradigm that follows, of course, the industrial age and capitalism, which is when we also urbanized. We leave rural and move to big cities. The vast majority of people in the world today live in cities, and the majority of people live in cities, live in big cities around the world. We created these huge metropolises, and we also then made human beings living closer together. And we talk about membranics, as we've done before, earlier in the book, that we discovered that membranics applied to these systems means that we can make these cities intelligent and sustainable. We call them smart cities today, even better. But here's the trick. The city of God is then not to cover the entire planet in a city, but it's to regard the planet as if it was a city. That means that all human beings on the planet must be treated as equals. And they start having this dream about the global empire. And technology will help us implement the global empire, wherein all people on the planet eventually actually have to communicate with each other and make peace with each other. And to then create a peace that works is the dream of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan thinking. And John and I are great advocates of cosmopolitanism. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in the nation state. I'm a liberal nationalist for practical purposes. I am a big fan of city-states like Singapore, Dubai, because I'm a big fan of creating these sort of houses, these compartmentalized places in the world where experimentation can take place. Because for human beings, it's important to have laboratories and to experiment in contained environments. But if those experiments are successful, they can be implemented everywhere and copied by everybody. And that's exactly what human beings do through trade. So to see the world as a global trading system to be pro-globalization in this sense, is to complement and complete a product that we call the city of God. And this was always inherent to capitalism. This was always inherent to industrialism. This was always inherent to urbanization. This was inherent to the European Enlightenment that was spread around the world from the 16th century forward. So we're great advocates of the Enlightenment. We're saying that the Enlightenment needs to be completed. And because we now have a boundary, it's planet Earth, this we humans have settled, we can then have another phallic gaze, not the phallic gaze that implements the Garden of God, but just the phallic gaze that implements the city of God. And we can go cosmopolitan, and we should. Then comes the third one. Tom, you can see it, I really laid it out here. It's like a finishing of the book, right? The third one is the Tower of God. And here's the really important trick. We've heard for a long time about the meaning crisis. And, you know, a great colleague of ours is John Vervaeke. I'm glad he's discovered the Silk Route Triad as well as we have in this book. And he's now going to pursue his own version of that. And that's amazing because I think cognitive scientists should definitely get engaged with the topics we address on Process and Event. So I welcome other philosophers going on the same journey that we did here. But I would say that the third one, the Tower of God, is the trick, because the problem is that by portraying the world as if we're reaching the end of the world is a lack of imagination. We talked about this before. When Nietzsche talks about the death of God, he really means the death of a paradigm. He means the death of a specific God, the Protestant God, that he mourns, that he misses because his father was a pastor or whatever in Germany, and he didn't believe in Christ, couldn't be Christian, and he had to give up on Christianity, and there was a nihilism that arrived because of that. But already in Nietzsche, there is this turn within nihilism, that nihilism could go into an affirmative state. What we then laid out in our work is that we said this picture, as many things in Nietzsche, is brilliant but incomplete. So we laid out is that a paradigm shift involves 4 different nihilisms. The first state of nihilism is the naive state. Nihilism is a given because you're seeing the end of the paradigm, but you refuse to see the end. Okay? So you don't know you're a nihilist yet, but actually you are already subconsciously a nihilist, and culture is becoming nihilistic. Then comes the second state, which is cynical nihilism, which means that I know this is the end of the paradigm. I know it's the end of the world. I know everything is over and done with. I know there is no meaning and there's no purpose to anything, but I will pretend as if there is. My accusation against Jordan Peterson. When Jordan Peterson says, for example, that I won't tell anybody whether I believe in God or not, but I will live as if God exists, and none of us believes him. He's a typical cynical nihilist. Don't trust a cynical nihilist, because cynical nihilist is self-contradicting. Where the cynical nihilist says that I will live as if the paradigm was still relevant, but I won't tell you whether I still believe in the paradigm or not. Then he certainly doesn't believe in the paradigm any longer, and he's a cynical nihilist. He's only trying to manipulate to keep some favors for himself within the old paradigm. So no matter how well-meaning it is, it's the end of the world for real. Cynical nihilism, the end game. But here's the catch. Because it's just a paradigm dying, it isn't the end of the world. It's the end of a world. It's the end of a certain precondition. For example, if you lived in an agricultural world and you were terrified of people moving to cities and making money and building factories, then you were stuck in Versailles in 1789, and you hated the people in the streets of Paris because you thought the streets of Paris would mean the end of the world. But it wasn't. It was just a new paradigm. Because the people in the streets of Paris could read, write, and count. And you were a proof in Versailles. You could do none of those things. So they came out to kill you because you were done with. You were a cynical nihilist. They were not. They were affirmative. And here's the trick with nihilism. Before nihilism can go affirmative, there has to be some kind of fundamental value underneath, which is, again, the phallic gaze. The phallic gaze must have a timeless value to be a phallic gaze. It must enjoy being the phallic gaze. And this is why the position we claim of the phallic gaze is what we call ironic nihilism. And the ironic nihilist always knew that there were no meanings out there and there was no purpose with anything, except that human beings are perfectly capable of creating their own meanings and their own purposes in between themselves. The sociont itself creates its own values, and that's the beauty of the sociont. And the ironic nihilist knows this. So the phallic gaze looking at us is always an ironic nihilist. This is the priestly gaze. It always knows that there are no values out there, but it's supporting us and helping us in creating values for ourselves. God himself doesn't need any values. God has no values. God is just looking at us, and then through just being there in our imagination, looking at us, by being seen by God, by being performative to God, by being performative to the sky God, human beings start imagining, what am I going to do today to show off to the phallic gaze? And what human beings do when they show off to the phallic gaze, precisely they go affirmative. So in this sense, the affirmative nihilism comes out of the ironic nihilism in response to cynical nihilism. And the cynical nihilism is the end of the old paradigm. And the affirmative nihilism arrives with full force, often conflictual, anarchic, doesn't know what it's doing, storms into the streets of Paris, says, we're the new, we can read and write down, we're going to change the world. We have no idea what we're doing, and it's going to be bloody at first, but we will do it. And this is the beautiful thing to see that this is the case with nihilism. The world is never nihilist in itself because it contains human beings, and human beings are living subjects. In intersubjectively between them, they always create values and they always create meanings and purposes. And it's only when they go decadent and they want to die and the motif takes over, which when they should die, to be honest about it, because somebody else will come along and certainly want to live. And if that is the case, then that's okay. The culture wants to live the most should take over the world and should be there. And that's Nietzsche's point. The affirmative should always win in those cases, and it will. And it will learn how to contain the world, through politics or whatever, so the world can still operate and be run. And it will create values, so that's best done. For example, the value of democracy was created where? In cities. So you had monarchy as an imaginary power when you created the Garden of God, but when you create the city of God, you get democracy and liberal democracy, for example, as a model. So these models follow the paradigms into this last state. And here's the point. The Tower of God is a very simple idea that I developed with John, because we're looking for what is the metaphor for knowing that the world is never over and done with. Even if human beings would go extinct, with AI around and technological intelligence take over outer space, we are at a point right now we can accept that even if human beings would go extinct, what would survive on other planets, coming off from planet Earth and our technological revolutions, will probably do okay. It will be a child. It will take care of itself, even if we, as its adults, would go extinct. And that's very comforting, because then we realize that the ultimate horizon we're talking about here is like a tower. Again, a phallic structure, sky god, phallic gaze. The best symbol for the phallic gaze is the tower. And therefore, the third construction is without paradigm. It isn't garden. It isn't city. It isn't any of these things. It's not even the internet. The internet is a web, if anything. No, it's a tower. But it's a tower that has a door. And on the door, there's a sign. And the sign says, you're not getting in here, but your children may. And please note here, what is the paradigmatic shift with that sign? Now we go into the internet age, is that the sign says, you're not getting in here. You'll die. You're not getting in here. The door will not open before you die. You will die. The door will still be closed. But your children might get in here. And for the first time ever, the children described in that sign might not be biological. For the first time, the masculine fantasy that the children in that sign on the Tower of God might as well be technology rather than being biology. That's the new shift, paradigmatically, that we're going into now. But by having the Tower of God there as a guarantee, we can never go nihilistic. It's just another paradigm coming.
So that's what you mean with the Bard Absolute in relationship to the Tower of God.
Exactly. Great point, Tom. The Bard Absolute we talked about before. When the sign says you're not getting in here, that means there's the Bard Absolute, not Bard like my last name, B-A-R-R-E-D, like a Bard Absolute. It's barred for you. It's closed. The Bard Absolute means you're not getting in here. And precisely because there's a Bard Absolute, we can imagine there's another world behind the Absolute. And that world is there for another generation to explore, but not for me. And I think when we die, if we die with a smile on your face, which all dream about doing, but if we die with a smile on our face, we die knowing that I did what you could do during a life, and the next generation will explore the same thing and come to the same conclusion that I did, that I lived a full life, I tried everything, I lived a whole life, I lived a whole vatat. as the coldest star. I lived a whole life. I was blessed enough to live a whole life. This is the dream we all have as human beings. But we can leave and drop off because we're now accepting the barred absolute. Okay, this is how far I could go. This is how far I could develop biology and technology and everything else in the world during my life while I lived. And the next generation can pursue even further. They can do an exodology from what I gave them, the heritage of it. They can do an exodology from that and go further, go even further and even further, even further, exploring even deeper. And there's no end to that. That's the point, what we call protopianism. So the point by doing this is that by laying out these fantasies that actually are, I think, are subconsciously very much there, they might terrify us, but they are the ultimate horizons of our human thinking. They've just taken human thinking to its limit, which is, number one, we're staying on planet Earth, and then we can develop an AI, and the AI will itself be intelligent enough to conquer outer space for as far as it likes, whatever. It can be programmed, say, off you go, out to outer space, do whatever you like with the rest of the universe. And it will. But what we can do here with us on the planet Earth, by having this boundary, we start looking at what exactly is the human condition. And we see the human condition very clearly with the Garden of God, the Seat of God, and the Tower of God. And what do these three God concepts have in common? Well, that's the interesting thing. We start looking at what kind of power structure we will get out of the internet age. And here we revisit our previous work. We revisit our first book, The Netocrats. I think we called it Nexilists and Eternalists and whatever else. I don't even remember, but we have three different terms for three different categories because we knew we wrote that book 24 years ago that in the Netocrats, we would have to have a power triad eventually. We'd say we're just playing around with the idea of what a power triad could look like in the internet age. And we called it's a netocratic power structure. We stay with the term netocratic. It's a fantastic term. It was invented by Kevin Kelly at Wired magazine in America. He also invented the term protopianism, which we remind him is actually Thrashokireti, which the Persians invented 3,700 years ago. Don't tell Kevin Kelly. But, sometimes Americans think they just invented something that an Indian or Iranian invented thousands of years ago, but that's very often the case. But we love the term protopianism. We love the term netocracy because they're very useful. But okay, what we're saying in this book is that we can now see very clearly, 24 years later, what the three different netocracies would look like. And we're then replicating what Jacques Lacan calls the power structures of the real and the symbolic and the imaginary. So there's always a real power, there's always symbolic power, and there's always an imaginary power in any paradigm. What establishes itself eventually because we human beings think in real, imaginary, and symbolic. Because we have three brains, we have an emotional brain, we have a rational brain and a mimetic brain. An argument is that the masculine brain tends to be stronger on actually the rational and the emotional side. Ian McGilchrist's brain again, the masculine brain. Whereas mimetic brain is weak in straight man, much bigger in gay man. Whereas gay men and straight women have a larger mimetic brain because they're in the mythos. And they're much better at storytelling, they're much better at theater, they're much better at urban life, they're much better at a lot of things that they're really good at because they're in the inner realm of the tribe or the social, and therefore they have a larger mimetic brain and they have smaller emotional, rational brains, which is good for them because they have to spend less time on rationality to control their emotions, which is what the masculine brain spends a lot of time. Why it has a big rational brain has so much emotions to take care of because men are so fucking emotional all the time. Not to speak of lesbians, of course, because they're the emotional human beings we'll ever meet because they fight with each other all the time and throw things at each other and things like that. So, which is funny. But if you have three brains, then power as a whole in a society must be reflected in three different dynamics. And those are the real, and that's the imaginary and the symbolic. And here's the question, so which one rises with them? Well, the symbolic is knowledge and control of knowledge, epistemological, when we talk about philosophically speaking. So the logos is firmly there, and that's the rational brain. Okay? So the rational brain gears towards towards that realm, right? And then we have the rational brain. Then we have the imaginary, which is when we say the word power and throw it at somebody, they immediately say, "Oh, a king has power," or a politician has power, or something like that. The imaginary is it's just to connect what you do, which is actually the mythos. And here lies the feminine. So the mythos, mimetic brain, social control lies in the imaginary. The different one, the imaginary. And the third one is the real, which is the asset of a given society. The main asset. In the internet age, that asset clearly is data, and not only collecting data and processing data, but it's also the data being able to communicate. So data processing is there. And the data processing, rather than the processing of money, which drove capitalism, in attentionalism, which we're moving into now, the real is data. And it's real because it's data about our attention. So whoever can get access to anybody else, get anybody else's attention, and get the data out of the person they're communicating with, will then have ultimate power in the real sense. And here you can see the pattern which we could not see 23 years before. We could not know, there wasn't a term called big tech in the year 2000. Google had just arrived, Facebook didn't exist yet. Apple was around and they made clumsy computers at the time. Microsoft was certainly around making office gear, but it was a very different company from today. OpenAI, none of those things existed. So you could not see any of those things, but big tech was materializing over the next few years. So clearly that is the first netocracy. And what is that netocracy good at? The real. So what they do is that they replace previous structures with the real, which is they replace capitalism. And capitalism before that replaced nobility who owned land. Went from land ownership to having tons of money in your bank account over to having data in computer centers. And the data centers now basically rule the world, and that's why all the satellites everywhere, and you can collect data about anything, and there's enormous power in that. So the real lies with big tech. That means big tech will outdo any previous power structure. Big tech will create lobbies everywhere. They will take over politics. They will take over academia. They'll take over everything they possibly can. But here's the catch. What big tech are not good at, they're not good at the symbolic or the imaginary. Because there's nothing in big tech in the way big tech is constructed that rewarded you for being good at symbolic or imaginary. That means there must be two other forms of autocracy being developed further down the line that complement. So you get the power triad eventually. And there's the symbolic. I know you, for example, Tom, you're having Zach Stein, who I think is fantastic at parallax these days. Going to welcome you. He's one of the sharpest minds on the planet. And Zach Stein in America, Alina Rachalands in Denmark, old friends of mine have been working for a long time on what it means to get educated in between paradigms. I disagree with Zach at one point. He still uses the word education. And here I side with Lena and say that we can't really talk about education longer because education is such an industrial term because we were educated to be workers. So basically the offer we were given during industrialism was that you're no longer a slave as you literally were when you were feudal and you worked in the fields for 6 days a week, and then the seventh day you went to church, and then a priest stood in the church or an imam stood in the mosque and lied to you and said that if you keep on working for 6 days next week as well, you can come back next Sunday and then you go to heaven when you die. The biggest lie ever. Well, feudalist religion had to promise you that because slavery was actually what you were installed with. So we moved from slavery to work, meaning I could have 16 hours to myself every day, but I sacrificed 8 hours a day to go to work. And I was educated to be a worker. But the term education is tied into that. Here's the thing with the internet age, because everything becomes relation, and I'm no longer a fixed object, and I'm being transformed my entire life. Here, Leni is right. Therefore, the word education is the wrong word. She uses the German word Bildung. There's no word for that in English, as you, Tom, knows, because you're German. Unfortunately, there's no word for that. The closest word we have to that is enculturation. At least Lena and I have agreed that we should use that word. So I no longer want to become an educated human being, because that's too instrumental. I want to become a cultured human being, because then I become an active relational agent. I can interact with human beings in all kinds of intelligent ways. I can interact with intelligent machines in all kinds of intelligent ways. By being uncultured, that means that if I get a personal AI, or the algorithms out that we talked about this before, are actually free and open, and they're actually interested in me rather than in big tech trying to exploit me, which current algorithms do, but I want an algorithm where I'm in charge and which is in my interest. And if I get an algorithm which is in my interest eventually, and I can then have a personal AI, I would ask that personal AI to challenge me my entire life and to teach me things that I'd be interested in my entire life. And to be my infotainment, meaning I want to be entertained and I want to be informed. Now, this is deeply, deeply human. We've written about infotainment, the infotainment principle before. It's the basics for algorithms online. We go searching and all that. I want to be informed and I want to be entertained. Now, if I can be both those two things with an AI that personally challenge my own life to grow and expand and transform and learn new shit, then who wouldn't want that? Any human being with self-confidence would love it. My mom is 90 years old. She's still super sharp. She loves to get up every morning and learn new shit. And she's 90. So if I want to learn things until the day I die with a smile on my face, I should be able to do that. And I will then tell everybody that I want a personal AI and I want an algorithm that helps me learn things the rest of my life. That's enculturation. Enculturation must be the basis for symbolic power. That means universities, educational institutions of today, done with. The death of Harvard, it's busy kidding itself at the moment, as you can see in America. The death of Oxford, the death of higher education. AI is the first major technological revolution that was not developed at universities. It was developed by the corporations themselves. Big tech is now developing the next generation of technology. It's no longer happening at universities at all. Okay, so if anything powerful coming out of universities is done with, and universities are a waste of time, get out and start looking for technologies that enable you to become encultured. And the sooner you get out of that educational paradigm and move into the paradigm of constant enculturation, which is your enculturation, other people's enculturation, you are going to be a force in the symbolic realm of the internet age. You're going to be what we call a protopian. A protopian. A person incrementally improves on the world, including yourself, every day. So protopianism is our ideal here. And protopianism will kill both utopianism and dystopianism. They were both wrong. And the great thing with protopianism as an idea, this is a Flash-Kritin person, is protopianism makes sense both in Eastern spirituality and in Western history. Western history, to its detriment, was stuck in between utopia and dystopia. We must get rid of both. They were terrible ideas. No, we can go protopian. And any Japanese, any Chinese, any Indian, any Peruvian, any Ethiopian person you meet, if you're American or English or German or whatever, will agree with you that is a great idea for human beings. Enculturation takes over. And enculturation, with deep respect for SAC, enculturation is the word for how I engage with the world in such a way that I learn new things all the time and I love learning. And that process is lifelong. It's no longer when I was a child, because you were educated to a certain thing. When you were 18 years old, you were supposed to go out and do work the rest of your life and exhaust yourself. Okay, then things become more advanced. Then you had to go study until you were 25. And suddenly you study until you're 30, and you realize the last 5 years were just a waste, because education is dead. And this is what the internet age does with us. We have everything around us and more intelligent tools, and we know where to go to find out things and learn all the time. I love learning. I learn all the time. I learn every day, and I love it. I love my machines. I love my laptop. I love my books. I love every way I can learn. I naturally want to be encultured, and so do you. And the people who become experts on enculturation, which is like a mix of what we call education mixed with therapy and mixed with challenging and coaching and retreat centers out there, monasteries are back. Anywhere you can go to fix yourself and learn about yourself and learn about the world is a good idea. So enculturation is symbolic power. And here's the trick. If you got the symbolic power, realize that the enculturation is very different from running a big tech corporation. You're not going to get enculturation experts coming out of Google or Microsoft. Realize that? If you realize that, you realize the two different realms. And if you have those two realms, and if you thereby set the rational and emotional, all you got left is the mimetic aspect, mimetic brain, the mythos that connects these two. And here's the trick with imaginary power. It can be empty. It still fills that role. It can be empty and still fill that role, but it doesn't have to be empty. And scaring enough, it probably won't be empty, because here's the threat. Over the next 50 to 20 years, here's the warning. The mimetic brain, collective mimetic brain, could go terribly wrong. Because with all the sensors everywhere, and with all our human senses on high alert, we're moving towards a state we call sensocracy. You know how we're stuck on this planet? You know we started tonight? We're stuck on this planet. It's a limit. It's a boundary. That means with all the satellites everywhere, I warned you and said the phallic gaze can go dark. But if the phallic gaze goes dark, because we're aware of it, we will all end up in a giant surveillance police state. That's a dark sensocracy. It's a very, very likely scenario. It is at least as likely as that human beings could blow themselves up with bombs. This is why I wish the technology can take off in such a way that if we do blow ourselves up with a bomb, or if you go into surveillance police state and there's basically tyranny where nothing new will ever happen, no innovation will happen, all creativity is done with, are being surveillanced on day and night. That's the nightmare of the sensocracy. And I argue that's exactly what the Confucian communist system of communist China is trying to do today. I hate it with a vengeance. I'm totally for a free and open sensocracy. And it sounds ridiculous. What do you mean? A free and open police state? Yes, it is a ridiculous idea. But this is my Tower of God as a philosopher. Passing on to the next generation of philosophers, you must solve that. What would it mean to have a world of satellites everywhere and the phallic gaze omnipresent everywhere? What would it mean to live in that world and still be able as a human being to be a free and open, live in a free and open society and be a free human agent? It's an impossibility. I'm giving up. I'm passing it on. It's my Tower of God as a philosopher to pass on to the next generation, to explore that question and imagine what that be like. And Max Borders here at Phallic is one of the guys who's taken on the challenge and says, yes, I want to see what that could be like. Is it possible to think decentralization instead of centralization? How could put stopgaps into the wheel for the surveillance not to happen? How could we get all the benefits of having all these machines everywhere without the negative side effects of all the machines being connected into one tyrant? So again, the two-headed phallus, we come back to that idea, must be implemented before we get the tyrant who takes over the world. Sensocracy is a totally open question, but sensocracy is the name of the imaginary power. And you can really sense it inside of yourself that you subconsciously are already terrified of the fact that we could have a global surveillance police state within a generation. Now, you should be terrified of that. Because the only thing that will make you do something against it, act against it, think against it, be creative against it, is by pointing out you don't want it. And that means you have to be an activist and fight the dark sensocracy in favor of a free and open sensocracy. So I hope I laid it out. I mean, these are the two axes that with the phallic gaze as a starting point, laid out that. So remember, you got the guard of God, the city of God, as completions of previous paradigms. The paradigms are never over. We're still talking to each other. We're still writing. We're also printing, and at almost no cost. And we're now also mass distributing electronically at absolutely zero cost at all, communicate with anybody in the world. So we're drenched in information. The next big thing is actually to have more instruments that can help us to sort out the information so we can spend our time wisely what we really want to do instead of wasting our time on things we don't want to do. That's like the ultimate product these days. So the city of God and the guard of God are completions of previous paradigms, and we should do that by building them into the whole idea of the Tower of God. And the Tower of God enables us to look forward. And this is what I'm saying at my generation, by laying out the problem with the sensocracy. Here's the enormous potential of technology, and here's the terrifying dark things with technology today. The bomb in 1945 and a closed tyranny, global tyranny, very much real. Using climate change and all these other things as excuses, of course. That's what a global tyrant would do. But tyranny could happen. And again, go back to the Persians and rethink the phallic gaze as split. If it's a two-headed phallus, suddenly we can avoid tyranny. And that's the precondition for creating a structure. So a sensocracy has to be split. It has to be split into three different factors, like the US Constitution has to be split into three different factors to be an empire that cannot control by anybody. A way to think it, just to give you a hint, is to think that if I give away the data about myself, if I give away the data just to the Central Communist Party computer, I'm pretty much going to have a tyrant within a generation. But if I give away the data to at least 5 different oligarchs, like big tech today, that's a better option because then I can put those 5 guys against each other. And I could switch from one of the guys to another one if one gets too big. So the great thing with market forces in that way, the market forces in themselves are already decentralizing power. And I think to think in that way, that how you can split power and split power and split power is the way to avoid that centralization that a surveillance police that will be going for. And to always have an escape route somewhere, an exodology, a plan, an exit plan, where you can move somewhere else in case you don't get what you want where you live and you're too controlled. And I think we should fight the attempt to control us by basically saying we're leaving. Like people are leaving China today and they're moving to America. And nobody's moving from America to China. And that's a healthy sign. Because if people are moving towards freedom and creativity, away from oppression, then that's a good sign. That's always a good sign. Yeah, that's the exodology. And then by looking at power, how it's structured today with the real and the symbolic and the imaginary, I think we can prioritize what we want. Here at Parallax, I'm being a philosopher, Tom being a philosopher. Here at Parallax, we concentrate completely on being protopians. We concentrate completely on culturation. That's exactly what Parallax is set out to do, and that's why I love being here. Because we're now in the symbolic realm, we're creating symbolic power, we're going to kill the world's universities, and we're going to do it by providing a lifelong enculturation every day at affordable prices to everybody.